Hello and welcome to my presentation about my research this summer. It is on the American Revolution and the British parliamentary reform of 1782. My research question was how did ideals from the American Revolution influence the British parliamentary reform movements of the 1780? Previous scholarship has been primarily interested in discussing parliamentary reform movements in Great Britain that occurred in the 1790s. And as a result, a lot of historians have attributed these reform movements to the ideals of the French Revolution. I was doing a little research into this, and I found that there were actually a lot of movements that started before the French Revolution. And so I wanted to find out whether or not the American Revolution and the political ideology that occurred from that event had any significance or influence on these earlier parliamentary reform movements. My methodology was about a close reading of two pamphlets in particular. I began my research just by reading over 100 political pamphlets that were published in Great Britain between the years of 1764 and 1784 from the Newberry Library in Chicago and Queen's University in Canada. I chose pamphlets because they were an immensely important form of debate and literature during the time period of the American Revolution and were used and written by people from all social backgrounds, which I think is really important when we're discussing a time period when most of the literature comes from the government and the more wealthy people in society. And so the two pamphlets that I ended up doing my research on were both published in 1783, when these parliamentary reform movements first came into being, A Constitutional Guide to the People of England by John Williams, and A Solemn Appeal by an Anonymous Author. Although I only found these two pamphlets that directly talked about how the American Revolution influenced Great Britain's parliamentary reform movements, I found a lot of references to these arguments, which makes me think that there are a lot more pamphlets out there that I didn't have access to, that shows that this was a very widely debated issue and that a lot of people saw the similarities between America and Great Britain's condition. So in these pamphlets, they used a couple of arguments that really identified, that really helped, that made me think that a lot of people in Great Britain identified with the Americans. They previously had been under a system of virtual representation for the most part, where they themselves were not directly represented. And although this system worked for a time, they thought that it was beginning to break down after the American Revolution. And the reason they thought this was mainly because the interests of industry were no longer sufficient. They wanted industrial leaders and people who really understood manufacturing to sit in Parliament as well. They also didn't think that Parliament was paying attention to petitions. So one of the reasons virtual representation was successful was that ordinary citizens could write petitions to Parliament, and Parliament would take these seriously. And during the American Revolution, British people no longer felt this was the case, and for that reason, they wanted to shift to a more directly representative system. And all of these things are very similar to what the American colonists went through. Furthermore, these pamphlets made direct appeals using American language. They said that the virtual representation of the people in the Commons is as great a mockery of common sense as the assertion that the Americans were virtually represented. They saw that it was a very similar situation, and they actually had some warnings. They said that because the Americans were denied direct representation and virtual representation by Parliament, they were worried that ordinary citizens of Great Britain may also be denied those same rights. And so they wanted to reform Parliament to prevent that from happening. And so the significance of this just shows that the impact of the American Revolution on Europe was much earlier than normally assumed. It did not start with the French Revolution. It started with these smaller and less successful movements in Great Britain. And it also shows that these debates, because they were happening through political pamphlets, which were available in coffee houses and taverns and meeting houses, that it was an extremely wide debate happening in Great Britain at the time. So a lot of people were taking the American argument seriously and using them to reform in Great Britain. Thank you.